Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining. I'm Katie Copel, the Senior Vice President and Head of Clinical Research with the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Parkinson's therapies today treat the symptoms of the disease. And there are a lot of options now for motor symptoms like the slowness, stiffness, and rigidity you think of with Parkinson's disease, as well as some of the non-motor symptoms. However, none of the treatments that are available today actually change the trajectory of the disease. They don't stop or slow the progression of Parkinson's. But on the horizon is a class of medications that could change everything, that could offer the promise of slowing or stopping Parkinson's progression and giving people living with the disease more time in the way that they are today. I'm so excited that we'll be talking about this type of progress in therapeutic development for Parkinson's in this webinar. Before I introduce our esteemed guests, I need to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, if you have a question, type it into the Q&A box near the middle of your screen. The foundation staff and our panelists will get to try to answer as many as we can. There isn't a general chat, so your questions will not appear for everyone else to see. I'll share key questions with the panelists throughout the conversation and during the dedicated Q&A session at the end. And if you want other helpful information, check out the resource list in your screen. Second, to add closed captions in English, please click the CC button on the bottom right of the media player on your screen. Third, like all of our webinars, this session will be recorded and available to watch on demand. This can be a great resource to share with loved ones who couldn't attend the live event or just rewatch at a later time. The on-demand version has captions available in a few different languages. Fourth, today's webinar receives support from Biohaven and Genentech. Thank you to them. And finally, if you're experiencing AV quality issues, please check the icon on your screen to make sure you have a strong Wi-Fi connection to support the live stream. Okay, so we've got a lot to discuss, and let me first introduce our panelists. Sarah Zenner-Dolan is a Parkinson's advocate. She was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 2018 and serves on several committees, including the Critical Path Institute Clinical Trial Endpoints Team and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration Advisory Committee. Thanks for joining us, Sarah. Dr. Ruth Schneider is a movement disorder specialist and researcher, as well as an associate professor at the University of Rochester. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Schneider. And Dr. Jiwon Oh is a staff neurologist, scientist, and medical director of the Barlow Multiple Sclerosis Program at St. Michael's Hospital, as well as an associate professor at the University of Toronto. Thank you, Dr. Oh, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this discussion. So today we're going to be talking about disease-modifying therapies. This is a lot to unpack in this word, and maybe Dr. Schneider, to start, could you help us understand this complex term? What is a disease-modifying therapy, and how should we be thinking about this as different from treatments that address the symptoms of Parkinson's disease?
Absolutely. So a disease-modifying therapy is a treatment that slows or halts the progression of Parkinson's disease by targeting the underlying biological processes. In a clinical trial, we might define this as how much somebody changes on a scale over time, or how much time passes until a specific event occurs. But what this might mean for you or your loved one in real life is preserving level of function, right? So delaying the time until somebody needs to use an assistive device to help with walking, or delaying the time till somebody has a fall. This ability to maintain your current level of function rather than continuing to progress or decline. In contrast, symptomatic therapies, of which we're fortunate to have many, only treat the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. In other words, they might help to do things like lessen tremor, help with stiffness, help address mood symptoms, but they don't do anything to affect the underlying disease progression.
And Sarah, maybe to you as a person living with Parkinson's, we've heard a doctor's perspective on what this does. Why do you think people with Parkinson's and their families should be excited about progress in developing treatments that could slow or stop Parkinson's?
I mean, as a person living with Parkinson's, it is so exciting to think about how a disease modifying therapy may preserve function, like Dr. Schneider just said. Things like walking, talking, thinking. Um, and what that to me means is that'll prolong independence, which is very important to me, and potentially delay long term complications. I'm very hopeful, and it motivates me to live my best today.
And at the Fox Foundation, we have been funding research for the past 25 years, trying to find treatments that change the trajectory to slow down the disease, stop it where it is, have been a key part of our funding philosophy over time. And when we ask people in our patient council and our community advisors like you, Sarah, where should we put our investments? Treatments that could change the outlook for people living with Parkinson's disease remains a really core priority. And so we are excited that there are new tools being developed to help us understand the underlying biology that Dr. Schneider talked about. The reason we have an opportunity to be closer to these treatments than ever is because we have a better set of tools to understand the biology and develop treatments that target the biology that leads to progressive Parkinson's disease. And Dr. O, you're a specialist in multiple sclerosis, and this is a field that already has treatments that are considered to be disease modifying. And it would be great to hear from you how these came about in the multiple sclerosis field, and give us a preview of what we could think lies ahead for Parkinson's disease.
Sure. I think MS is a pretty unique chronic neurological disease where I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the availability of disease-modifying treatments in the last quarter century has completely changed the face of MS. And so, as with most things, things started slow. And it was really in the kind of mid to late 90s when the first disease-modifying treatments became available. And because at the time there wasn't a clear understanding of how important it is to start these treatments as early as possible and how important it is to monitor people very closely, not just clinically, but also using tools like MRI, it took a while to catch on. But since that time, and really after the availability of the first disease-modifying treatments, it was about a decade later when we started getting treatments starting in 2010. So every year or two, we would actually get new disease-modifying treatments. And it's to the point now where in most parts of the world, there's almost 25 different unique treatments for MS. And so, with the availability of these treatments and then accumulating science that demonstrated really clearly how important it is to start treatments as early as possible in as many people who need treatment as possible, we now have really clear management guidelines in MS. And the goal, of course, is to maximize clinical outcomes. And so, with the widespread use of these treatments, more and more effective treatments, I would say MS that we are treating now is completely different from MS that we were treating 25 years ago. And you can even see it in the conversations that we have with people living with MS and people who are diagnosed for the first time. Back 25 years ago, even when those first treatments became available, we were still telling people that at about 10 to 15 years, at least half of people living with MS would require a cane or a walker or a wheelchair for ambulation about 10 to 15 years down the road. And as you can imagine, having these conversations with people who are typically in their late 20s or early 30s can be pretty devastating. But these days, that conversation has completely changed, where we talk about, the goal really being to minimize any evidence of disability in the longer run. So those, discussions that we used to have 25 years ago no longer apply. So I could talk about this for hours, but really not an exaggeration to say that disease-modifying treatments over 25 years has completely changed the way we look at MS and treat MS, and has resulted in incredibly positive outcomes for people living with the disease.
Thank you. That gives so much hope for the type of transformation we're hoping for in Parkinson's disease. Since we're not there yet and you've had 25 years of experience, I think the community for Parkinson's should expect something that's maybe incremental progress. And Dr. Schneider, maybe you could talk about what you think the first disease-modifying treatment might look like and whether people would need to take that alongside their standard medication, or how adjuvant therapies work in a clinical care setting, why you might need to take more than one medication, even if something is slowing down your Parkinson's disease.
Absolutely. First off, I just feel so excited about hearing everything that has happened in the multiple sclerosis space over the last 25 years. It's certainly very inspirational, and I think gives us, as the community of Parkinson's disease researchers, a very tangible goal to shoot for and to learn from all the experience. I also want to reflect on one important comment that the last speaker made, which is the importance of intervening early. And so I think this is something that we are learning in the Parkinson's disease field, that these studies where we're examining whether something can slow the progression of the underlying disease, they really need to be conducted in the earliest stages. And so most clinical trials in this space are looking for people who are within about 2 years of their initial Parkinson's disease diagnosis and are not yet on any symptomatic therapy. And I think this is most likely, the group that stands to benefit the most from disease-modifying therapies when they first emerge. Now, as Katie mentioned, it is unlikely, I think particularly with this first generation of disease-modifying treatments, for people to expect that they can stop taking their symptomatic medications. And so I think the expectation should be that the disease-modifying treatment will be one component of your treatment plan that will be supplemented by symptomatic medications like levodopa, and will be supplemented by exercise and other lifestyle changes. Katie, you asked me a lot of things in that question. Did I cover it all?
It was perfect. And maybe going back to Dr. O, you talked about the transformation that happens over the last 25 years. You didn't say that the patients had been cured. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the expectation of a disease-modifying therapy and how important that remains, even if it may not be considered a cure.
Sure, Katie. And I think this is a really important point. Earlier, when I talked about, the beginning of disease-modifying therapies in MS, things started slow. And this is what happens in science, I think, really, and medicine. To make any meaningful change, we would all love for things to be instantaneous and have a magic wand and instantly have these incredibly highly effective therapies, or therapies that actually cure a disease. But it really is difficult to happen so quickly. And so I think this incremental benefit that often happens over time, and then when you have a certain increment, you build on that and you build, and then you get to the point where you actually do have these dramatic therapies that completely change the course of a disease. That's a really important thing to remember, because I think we're all so impatient and want to have cures immediately. But it's very difficult to get a hold of all of the complex disease processes that drive chronic neurological diseases like Parkinson's disease, like multiple sclerosis. And so because of this, I think we need to be patient. And with the first disease-modifying treatments in MS, we look at these days the amount it would reduce relapses. And we look at these therapies as, low efficacy therapies. And these days, we really wouldn't use most of them. But it was only because of the availability of those therapies at the beginning that we accumulated enough information and scientific evidence to make things better. And so now we're looking at therapies that literally have triple the benefit of what those early therapies had. But it was because of that incremental accumulation of benefit and science that we've been able to now land on these therapies that we consider to be highly effective. So I think the bottom line is, in any complicated neurological disease, the goal always is a cure. And the goal always is an extremely highly effective therapy that from the beginning acts really quickly and takes away nearly all evidence of the disease. But in order to get to that point, there usually is a period of time where you need to kind of celebrate the incremental benefits that you can see and then improve on that so you can get to that target of highly effective therapies and maybe even a cure.
And this is why I think it is such an exciting time and a moment to celebrate the progress that's been happening in Parkinson's research with the disease-modifying therapies that are being tested in clinical trials. And maybe we can just take a minute and pinging off that very helpful response, Dr. O, to hear from some members of the Parkinson's community on what this first type of treatment would mean to them as first steps on the way to something bigger.
My biggest fear with Parkinson's disease is not being able to take care of my family. It gets to where I have some pain, some slowness, some muscle issues.
One of the things that I've had to learn is that my day is not as long as I've been in the past, meaning where I just would go and go and go. Now, I hit a point by usually the afternoons where I hit the wall.
I've always been the type of person who likes to plan, who knows what I want to achieve, and that kind of approach to my life just went out the window. The uncertainty is probably one of the worst effects of the disease.
I'm scared about my future because of the fact I am single. I'm 59 years old, and if I don't keep working, how do I afford this disease? And if I do keep working, how much stress is that going to cause in my life? And how much more difficult is that going to make it for me just to keep going?
After receiving my diagnosis and knowing about the fact that there were no drugs to slow down the progression made me really look at life differently.
When I heard he had the Parkinson's, right away I looked up the levodopa and the other medications that are out. I was not happy that there isn't a medication that's actually helping to stop the progression of the depletion of dopamine.
I was happy to start the Matopar, which is what I'm on now, but I'm just being very careful about not increasing it. I'm trying to buy myself as much time as I can so I don't develop the negative side effects and so that the medication doesn't become ineffective too quickly.
We tried a number of different medications to try to get to that initial first cocktail that would kind of hide the symptoms and let me go on with life.
I think a disease-modifying treatment where the disease itself is tackled is the obvious thing we have to do. If there was a treatment that would allow me to slow my progression, that would just be so exciting. I've been playing the piano for 60 years now, and in the past several years, I can hardly do it. So I would tolerate pretty much anything. I don't like injections, but if that's the only way that one can do it, I would learn to tolerate that.
3 months ago, I was able to walk my dog, wash my car, or mow the lawn. So I would want to do anything, whether that is going in for infusions, injecting myself at home.
I bought a beautiful new blouse that I wanted to wear, and I was going to wear it to work, and it was a bright spring color, and I wanted it just to feel like spring, and I couldn't button the buttons. And I've never not been able to button buttons on a shirt. The physical abilities I had 3 months ago feel like they've slipped away and that they're gone. If you could have told me I could have walked through fire to slow the progression down, I would have done it.
I have a cross trainer that I've used for years, and even through the Parkinson's, I would push through to be able to do anywhere from 40 to 45 minutes of cardio. When I went down to work out last week, I can't do 45 minutes anymore.
You know, you get up this morning and you don't know if another symptom is going to happen. That's a scary thing to me. So 3 months, 6 months, any amount of time is better than nothing.
I'm a great believer in research. I know that research and all knowledge is accretive. You have to do so many, you have to go down dead ends. You have to learn what you don't know to learn what you need to know. And that all takes time. So yes, there's the cure, but there's also all the life improving therapies that happen on the way to the cure.
Everything needs a starting point. And if you give me 3 months, how do we know that there is going to be some kind of a treatment moving forward that's going to change that 3 months to 6 to 9 to 12? As long as you're seeing positive movement.
I don't know that I'm going to see a cure in my lifetime, but what if I felt just a little bit better for a little bit longer? That'd be pretty amazing.
What a powerful video. And maybe, Sarah, this is the right time for you to reflect on and share how you think about the value of slowing progression, what that would mean to your life, and how you think about this in the context of time, whether that's months, years, and maybe share some of your specific perspectives.
Sure, thank you. It's really emotional to even go to this idea that that there's a possibility on the horizon. And like we just heard, any slowing of progression is valuable. Months of slowing may sound like not very much, but it can give us, I mean, if there's something that could give me the ability to tap on the brakes of my disease progression, I'll take it. Something to slow things down until the next one comes out. I'll take it. I'll take whatever I can get. And I'm sure that my husband, my children, my family would agree. Any kind of benefits, any slowing is better than nothing. So I want to attend all my children's weddings and hold my grandchildren and attend ceremonies and have anniversaries. So I'm very hopeful. We're all very hopeful, but it is emotional to think about.
I think some of the specific types of life events that what more time would give you are on a different time frame than what clinical trials operate on. And so maybe Dr. Schneider, could you just talk a little bit about how researchers and drug developers think about measuring benefit in the time course of a clinical trial versus the way you might assess benefit in treating a patient long-term as they continue in their journey with Parkinson's?
Absolutely. I think, unfortunately, with the current state of research, that there's a little bit of a gap in those two things, right? Clinical trials often measure things like how you perform on a certain scale or how you report that you are feeling. Or we might look at, for example, how long is it until you need to start a medication like carbidopa, levodopa, or how long until you need help with walking or until you have your first fall. And I think that doesn't always translate well to real life, right? When I'm in clinic seeing patients, nobody is asking me what is their rate of change on the MDS-UPDRS motor scale. That's not really a clinically meaningful measure for people. So I think we need to do better. I think we need to make sure that we're really assessing how people are feeling and functioning and making a difference with our therapies that impact Parkinson's disease progression. And what I hear about it in my clinic is much what the speakers have already reflected on, right? It's making sure you can attend those life events, that you can continue to live independently. I think that's what we're all shooting for. And we're hoping that what we see in these shorter term clinical trials translates to those very real life impact.
Great. Let's talk about some of those treatments that are in development, jumping ahead to the research progress, and excited to share that the Fox Foundation, of course, is always tracking what's happening in the clinical research pipeline, whether we're funding it, supporting it through resources like Fox Trial Finder that help connect people to trials, or just generally staying engaged. And we're excited that almost half of the treatments in the Parkinson's pipeline today are aimed at slowing Parkinson's progression. And there are a few different mechanisms that are leading the pack right now based on what we understand about the biology. And Dr. Schneider, maybe you could just talk a little bit about what are some of the leading therapeutic targets for treatments that are aimed at changing the trajectory of Parkinson's.
Yeah, so one of the things that I often tell my patients in clinic and highlight is, and one of the things that gives me hope, is that there are so many smart people and research teams who are really invested in finding the disease-modifying treatments for Parkinson's disease. And they're all thinking about this from different angles. So we're not all focused on the same target. And I think that's really important, because the underlying biology of Parkinson's disease is not the same for everyone. So there's differences. And I think it's unlikely that there's going to be one magic bullet that helps everybody with Parkinson's disease, and more likely that we're going to really need to figure out, okay, what is the best target for this person who has this type of Parkinson's disease? And that's why it's so important to be working on multiple different targets. So what are some of those targets? So some of the big ones are alpha-synuclein. So alpha-synuclein is a protein that we all have in our bodies. In Parkinson's disease, it becomes misfolded and it clumps together. And this is what we see in Lewy bodies, which are one of the hallmarks of Parkinson's disease. And as Katie mentioned, the Michael J. Fox Foundation has really been instrumental to advancing a new way of identifying people who have this abnormal alpha-synuclein protein in their cerebrospinal fluid. And that's going to really help us to make sure that when we're developing these therapies, we're targeting them towards people who have this specific problem, right? And so with alpha-synuclein as a target, what we're looking at is, are there ways to prevent the clumps from forming? Are there ways to break down the clumps once they are there? And so there are a number of different companies that are looking at this approach. One that's been in the news lately has been prasinezumab, which is moving ahead to a phase 3 trial based on some really encouraging earlier phase results. Another strategy is to think about targeting genes that are associated with Parkinson's disease. So we think that about 10%, maybe up to 15% of people with Parkinson's disease have an associated genetic variant. And some of the common ones are GBA1 and LRRK2. And so having these genetic targets can really point us to a specific biological target that we can develop therapies for, right? And there's some evidence to suggest that, yes, these might work best for the people who have these genetic variants. But LRRK2, for example, is also part of the biology of people with non-genetic forms of Parkinson's disease. So it might be a strategy that really applies to a relatively broad group of people with Parkinson's. Another one is neuroinflammation. And, perhaps this is an area where we can really learn from our colleagues in the multiple sclerosis field. So, we know, for example, that neuroinflammation occurs in Parkinson's disease, and it might kind of explain the link between what we see in the brain and what is happening in the gut in Parkinson's. And so there are different strategies to find ways to kind of damp down that inflammation to help slow the progression of Parkinson's disease. Another category I'll mention is thinking about how can we reuse drugs that are already approved for other indications, right? So these are drugs where we know a lot about them because they're already on the market to treat another condition. And sometimes either through epidemiological studies or just what we observe in our clinics, that can suggest that one drug might be repurposed to help with Parkinson's disease. So this is another area of active research. And I think the last one I'll mention is cell-based therapies. So cell-based therapies are examining the idea of, can we use stem cells to create dopamine cells or dopamine precursor cells, and then implant them into people with Parkinson's disease to really get at the kind of heart of the issue with Parkinson's disease and ultimately help to slow the progression. So again, a lot of different targets that are being investigated, and I think a lot of promising research, and I certainly feel optimistic about the progress we can make in the coming years.
I think the robustness of the clinical pipeline, having different targets, different approaches for addressing that progressive underlying pathology of Parkinson's is exciting, because at this early stage, we want to be where MS is, but we're not yet there for Parkinson's. We need a lot of shots on goal to increase the opportunities for success, and new knowledge about understanding Parkinson's disease is going to make those trials more successful. I think, Dr. Schneider, you also hit on a piece that we think is going to be evolving for neurological conditions generally, which is the idea of personalized medicine. Not everybody's Parkinson's is the same. And so the opportunity to have different targets may also mean that certain people will get the right treatment for them. And so we're really excited about the variety of approaches that are moving forward. You mentioned a couple of, at least one study that's getting ready to launch in phase 3. There's a neuroinflammation study that's approaching late stage clinical development. And so this sounds exciting. It sounds like we're getting closer, but I wanted to also provide a reality check just to make sure that we know how long we should be waiting. And Dr. O, maybe you could talk a little bit about the realistic timeline it takes to bring forward new biologically targeted therapies for slowing neurological diseases and bringing it to market, maybe thinking about late stage development. How soon should we be ready for something that's outside of the context of clinical trials?
So I think we touched on these points earlier, Katie, with the incremental benefit, but even the process of drug development unfortunately takes quite a long time. Even if you don't account for all the years that a molecule is developed in the lab, even when it gets to very, very early human studies, and it actually can take a really long time from a drug being discovered and then tested in test tubes in vitro, and then tested in animal models. And then even that transition to being tested in humans can take a really long time. But when we look at drug development from the very early studies, looking at phase 1 studies, which are studies where different doses are evaluated, often in healthy participants, as well as in people living with a certain disease. And then it goes on to phase 2 studies if there are no serious issues identified there. And the phase 2 studies are usually the studies where they're often referred to as proof of concept studies, where you can show in a smaller population of people living with, say, Parkinson's disease, that there is a beneficial effect of the drug. And then that transition to the large phase 3 trials can take some time. So overall, on average, I'd say it probably takes nearly 10 years for that entire process to happen. But the step from going from a phase 2 trial to a phase 3 trial, I would say, is one of the biggest hurdles. And the fact that there's a number of specific therapies for Parkinson's that have overcome that giant hurdle is incredibly encouraging. So these things don't happen too quickly, but it really is encouraging to hear that there are a number of therapies that have gotten over what I think is the biggest hurdle, which is getting into phase 3 clinical trials.
Great. And thank you for that overview of the different steps in the clinical research process. This builds a body of evidence that gets brought forward to different regulators, like the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, that looks at the clinical benefit versus any potential safety risks of new drugs. And Sarah, I know that you're actually a representative, a patient representative on the FDA advisory committee, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what confidence it gives you, even if this process is long, that the data gets evaluated and that the perspectives of treating clinicians and patients are part of an advisory committee that looks at the opportunities for new drugs to provide benefit to patients.
Right. So I am fortunate enough not only to have Parkinson's, but I do represent the patient voice on an FDA advisory committee, and it's really it's great to know that the FDA is listening. They know the data, and they are looking very closely at making sure that drugs are safe and efficacious. But also, they listen to us as patients. And I was at a more recent review of a drug for Alzheimer's disease. And while we were there, we heard testimony from patients, from family, from caregivers, to hear what a drug, what a disease-modifying therapy would mean to them and to their lives. And overwhelmingly, the majority, not everybody, but the majority definitely said that any slowing down of their progression, any way they can keep their loved one even where they are for a short amount of time, to preserve their cognition, meant more time with their loved ones and potentially a better quality of life. So it is good to know that the FDA has very good intentions, and that they listen to us as patients.
And for international audiences, there are other regulatory authorities out there that are thinking about this patient voice against data, clinical evidence, biologic evidence about drugs and how they're working to provide benefit. We have a great audience question. Maybe Dr. Schneider, you could talk a little bit about this. How would different stakeholders know if a treatment is actually altering the disease? How would biomarkers fit into that plan, and how would that link to the clinical outcomes people are looking for?
Yeah, so this is an incredibly challenging aspect of conducting Parkinson's disease modifying trials. And this might be one key difference between where we stand with Parkinson's disease and the experience in multiple sclerosis, where you could use neuroimaging, you could use MRI scans of the brain to help track progression over time. So in Parkinson's disease, unfortunately, we don't have any good reliable markers of disease progression. We mentioned before that we have this new alpha-synuclein marker that can help us kind of identify who has this problem with their alpha-synuclein protein. But there's more work to be done there, right? Right now, it's only helpful for us in saying, does somebody have it or do they not have it? What we need next is to identify something that is objective and that changes over time, right? And once we have something like that, whether it's something we measure in fluid like blood or cerebrospinal fluid, or it's something we measure through brain scans, I think that is really going to help to accelerate the pipeline. And the issue is that without that, it can often be hard in trials to differentiate what is really disease-modifying benefit, what is slowing the progression, and what is maybe symptomatic benefit. Because a lot of the medications that we try to target the underlying biology of Parkinson's disease also happen to have some symptomatic benefit. And so there's ways right now that we can approach this and how we design the study and when one group of participants starts the drug intervention versus another. But really what would help to accelerate this is having a biomarker of disease progression.
That's been another long time area of focus for research funding for the Fox Foundation, and why initiatives like the Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative are so critical. And I'll get to that in a moment. Before we go there, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about one intervention that's already available today to help people live well with Parkinson's for longer and potentially change the outcome of that, and that's exercise. Dr. Schneider, what should people know about exercise as a treatment for Parkinson's?
Yeah, so exercise is, in my opinion, an extremely important component of managing Parkinson's disease. It helps people feel better, helps them function better, and we think it can help to slow the progression of disease as well. And I often get asked, what is the best type of exercise? And I personally think that the best evidence is for moderate or higher intensity aerobic exercise, right? So these are things that are going to elevate your heart rate. And we have really good evidence that they help to impact how somebody feels, and increasing evidence that they might actually modulate some of the brain networks and change the underlying progression in Parkinson's disease. So what I tell folks typically is to shoot for 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity exercise. And this, typically is some form of aerobic exercise. Might be brisk walking, it might be cycling, just as two examples. And to set that as a goal, right? We can never go from 0 to 100, right? We have to start somewhere, so we can build up to that goal over time. And I think that can really be a nice complement to all of the other treatments that we use to manage Parkinson's.
Sarah, I know, like many other people in the Parkinson's community, you track exercise and lifestyle habits along with symptoms. How does that help you manage your Parkinson's?
Well, I started doing that. I started tracking sort of my movement during the day with how I feel. I started doing that 6 years ago, and it actually, it's crazy how some patterns keep on showing up, and that when I exercise, I tend to feel a whole lot better than when I don't. And this is before I even knew about the correlation between exercise and how important it was for those of us living with Parkinson's to move. I've found that if I don't exercise for even a few days in a row, that I'm going to have a bad day. And I know it's really hard to motivate yourself to do something like exercise when you're having a bad day. But like Dr. Schneider was just saying, you almost have to set it as a goal. I think about exercise as taking my medicine, and I don't miss my medicine, so why should I miss my exercise? I'm not perfect with it, but it definitely makes a huge difference on my mood, and it keeps me strong, so that so I can keep on going.
Great. Practical advice while we're waiting for disease-modifying therapies to move forward. And one of the key opportunities to advance these treatments is to better understand Parkinson's disease, the natural history of the disease, the way it progresses biologically and clinically. And I wanted to take a moment to call out the Foundation's landmark study, the Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative, also known as PPMI. PPMI is recruiting volunteers. People from all backgrounds, both with and without Parkinson's, can help move research forward, and encourage you to think about how you can join the study that's changing everything by clicking the link in the resource list on the right side of your screen. So let's pick back up on, we're going to learn more from PPMI. There are already treatments that are in development, and I think this opportunity to link basic science advances where we have opportunities to take better understanding of the disease, develop drugs, and then bring them forward through clinical trials is creating this robust pipeline. And we have a question from the audience. We're excited about these treatments. How do people get involved in research? And maybe more specifically, Dr. Schneider, how does somebody identify, potentially qualify to select the right people to participate in those types of clinical trials that are targeting specific biologies?
So I would recommend two strategies. So one is turning to reliable sources like the Michael J. Fox Foundation for information on clinical trials. So MJFF has a great online tool called the Fox Trial Finder. I often recommend it to my patients, and I have posted studies that I've been doing on there as well. And this tool can help you find clinical trials that are in your area and that are the types of studies that you might be interested in participating in. There are other resources out there. The Parkinson's Foundation also has excellent resources. Another one is clinicaltrials.gov, which is a very broad listing of trials that are available, not just within Parkinson's disease, but kind of across health and disease. And the other thing that I think is really important is to talk to your doctor. So they can really really help you evaluate a specific clinical trial opportunity. They can help you figure out what are the questions that you want to make sure you ask when you're considering this, and ultimately help you make a decision about whether or not you want to participate. And so I think when it comes down to, if there's a trial that you think you might be interested in, strongly encourage you to ask questions. So you want to find out what is actually involved in this study, right? Not just is it an oral drug treatment, or is it an observational study where there isn't an intervention? You want to get down a bit to understand the details. So how often do I have to come in for a visit? What am I going to be doing during those visits? How long does my participation last? What happens to my data? Those are just kind of a few of the high-level questions that might help you figure out if this is the right opportunity for you. And the last thing I'll say is that there are research opportunities out there for everyone. So there are ways for folks with Parkinson's disease at various stages to be involved. There are ways for people without Parkinson's disease to get involved. And increasingly, there are ways for people who are at risk due to, poor sense of smell, or what we call dream enactment behavior. There are ways for those folks to get involved in research too. So I think we can all help to move progress forward here.
This is great. And you're reminding people that they are consumers of research, and the Fox Foundation often works with sponsors to say, patients, families have a choice between the trials they participate in. You need to make it attractive for them. And so I think all the ways that you shared for people to be informed about what trials they select and find as right for them is all part of this bigger picture. Before we get into some Q&A, maybe Sarah, you could talk about experiences of what participating in research is like, what value it brings to them. I know we talked about your experience reviewing data from clinical trials that have different participants, but I know you have direct experience as a research participant as well, and what value that brings to you individually.
So yeah, I have been in several clinical trials, and right off the top of my head, I can think that one of the biggest benefits is that it provides access to excellent care. These visits that have been talked about, you're going to see a doctor on a very, very regular basis, and they're watching everything that's going on with you. And what that does is it gives you a better understanding of your current status, and you get sets of eyes on you that maybe you otherwise wouldn't have. And of course, you're being part of the solution, potentially getting to be part of research and moving the needle forward. So it's a very rewarding. Even though I was in a clinical trial, one of them didn't meet its primary endpoint, which was pretty devastating. We're putting our diagnoses to good work, which is good.
The beautiful gift. We say this all the time at the Fox Foundation. There's no amount of research funding that will fill the people needed for a clinical trial. And so thank you, Sarah, for participating. Thank you for others who take that step to participate in research, whether it's a clinical trial, a study like PPMI, or any way that you're contributing to Parkinson's research. You're advancing knowledge and helping us get better treatments faster. Maybe a couple questions to open up the Q&A, and this is a reminder, as you're entering questions, you have in the Q&A box, you can do that on your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. We have one, and Dr. O, I'd love for you to start, and then maybe Dr. Schneider could come in and link to Parkinson's disease. We have a question about mitochondrial-based targets, and I know these are some of the things that are of interest in MS as well, and how this does or doesn't intersect with neuroinflammation, which was a bullet on one of our earlier slides.
So I think earlier when I discussed all the successes of therapy in MS, one thing that I didn't talk about at the time was that as we've developed these therapies that really almost abolish all evidence of any acute focal inflammation in MS, we're recognizing that there still is disease happening that's often beneath the surface. And so in the MS field, we've been so used to looking for clinical evidence of relapses and MRI evidence of relapses, which are new lesions. But now that we have these extremely effective therapies that in many people get rid of any evidence of relapsing disease activity, we're recognizing that there is in almost all people with MS this slow neurodegenerative component that is very similar to what one might see in a chronic disease like Parkinson's. And so this is kind of the unmet need in the MS field. And so we're recognizing that we have a lot to learn from chronic diseases like Parkinson's, because we're recognizing that we've treated a big component of MS, but there is this whole component that we have not addressed. And so this is why there's a whole movement in MS to look for therapies that may actually address these neurodegenerative mechanisms, and therapies that target energy metabolism within cells, specifically neurons, as well as oligodendrocytes, which are the cells that generate the myelin sheathing around neurons, are of high interest in MS. And so in the MS field, there's many different categories of therapies that are now being evaluated, specifically that target this progressive neurodegenerative component. And there are some therapies that are looking at energy metabolism, specifically targeting mitochondria, similar to what it sounds like is being done in the Parkinson's field. So most of these therapies are still in very early stages of disease, but as I'm hearing Dr. Schneider and Sarah talk about their experiences, we're also struggling right now in MS with the right biomarker outcomes to use in clinical trials so that we can effectively cycle through some of these potential therapies to actually figure out whether they're targeting the disease or not. So I think there's a lot of similarities and many different categories of drugs that across the two fields are simultaneously being evaluated.
Great. Dr. Schneider, anything you add on the question related to mitochondrial targets, inflammation specific to Parkinson's disease?
Oh, I think Dr. O nicely covered it. I'll just add that mitochondria are another target of interest in Parkinson's disease. And the ones that I mentioned earlier should not at all be taken as the definitive list. There are certainly other targets that are of interest. I'll also add that there is a lot of interplay between these different categories, right? And so sometimes drugs that we're studying will impact multiple different targets, right? So if we improve mitochondrial function, does that help reduce inflammation? Potentially, just as one example. So just wanted to highlight how a lot of these targets and processes that underlie Parkinson's disease are really interconnected.
There was a question about DBS, deep brain stimulation, which is a treatment that's available today, can help people live well with Parkinson's and specifically address a lot of the more advanced motor symptoms. But I think the person is asking about, are they able to participate in trials? And maybe Dr. Schneider, could you talk a little bit about common eligibility criteria for clinical trials and what people that have received DBS or considering DBS could consider as it relates to research participation?
Sure. So one of the things we try to address when we conduct disease-modifying clinical trials is to come up with a sample of participants, a trial population, who are all similar to each other in where they are in the progression of their disease and the underlying biology of their disease. And trying to make the population as homogeneous as possible really, we think, increases our chances of success in measuring and finding a therapy that ultimately does impact the underlying progression of Parkinson's disease. And so with this in mind, we do a couple things. So one is we shift towards thinking about what is the earliest point that we can intervene and really focusing on those folks. And DBS is not something that is typically offered for folks with really early stage Parkinson's disease. So that's one reason why people with DBS are likely not to be eligible for disease modifying trials. The other reason is we try to minimize as many variables as we can when we're doing these studies, because we really want to understand what is the intervention that we're assessing, what is the study drug actually doing or not doing. And so there's often a lot of restrictions around whether somebody has had a surgical intervention like DBS or focused ultrasound, or whether they're on medications to treat their Parkinson's disease. So typically, folks who've had an intervention and folks who have already started symptomatic therapies would not be eligible to participate in disease-modifying trials.
There's another theme coming up with our audience Q&A. We've talked about, final stage of clinical research being phase 3. Mentioned, Dr. Schneider, that there was at least one program moving forward into phase 3 that was on this list of targets. But, are there any treatments that you think that are new, not repurposed, that you would expect to be approved as disease-modifying products in the next couple of years?
While I would love to say yes, unfortunately, I think that's too ambitious of a timeline. I think we're looking at more like 5 to 10 years out from now, although these things are of course, very hard to predict.
And maybe could you talk a little bit about how to turn that frown upside down with the concept you had talked about earlier with repurposed drugs and how those can move through the pipeline in a different fashion?
Yeah, that's a great point. So repurposed drugs, which again are drugs that have already been tested and studied and are approved to treat other conditions, can move through this pipeline considerably faster because of how much we already know about them. So that process is much more abbreviated than starting with a compound and then testing it in animals, moving to people without disease, and then moving to people with Parkinson's disease. So that might be a more realistic, more achievable goal for within the next 5 years.
And maybe going back to you, Sarah, you talked about some of the benefits of participating in research, and the Fox Foundation works closely with other patient advocacy groups. I know there's a great, very strong advocate in the ALS community that said the first person that's going to benefit from drugs are those that are in the clinical trials. And I'm curious if that point resonates with you and is part of the consideration that you've had about participating in research.
It was part of the equation. Interestingly enough, I found out later that I was on, there's always the chance that you're going to be on a placebo. And when clinical trials are designed, they're designed so that there's no harm that's going to be done. But you do have to understand that placebo is a potential for you. I didn't look at it that way. Actually, for me, being part of bringing the answer or finding an answer was more of the motivating factor than anything for me. Being part of the solution.
I love that. And there's such a great community of Parkinson's, and we hear, especially in studies like PPMI, where there is no drug being tested, that people are doing it to help advance science, to help better understand disease, to support therapeutic development for themselves, for future generations. And so thank you for that generosity. Thank you to everyone for joining us today and for being part of our community. Thank you, Dr. O, Dr. Schneider, Sarah, for sharing your time and your expertise. We'll be sending a link to the webinar on demand to watch again and share as you like. And we hope you found today's discussion helpful. Thank you and have a great day.